Good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning on the West Coast. Good evening in parts beyond. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service. And this is another one of our fast break, this time with Professor Irfan Nooruddin. It's great to have you here, Irfan. Irfan is the al-Thani Professor of Indian Politics here at the School of Foreign Service. He studies comparative economic development, policymaking, democratization, democratic institutions, as well as a deep specialization and knowledge on South Asian politics. It's wonderful to have Irfan here with you. So the ground rules, as always, for this is that I will ask Irfan a range of questions on the current moment, but I will also be trying to incorporate your questions into the conversation. I won't be identifying individuals and questioners by name, but if you have a question, you're welcome to put it into the Q&A function, which I will be monitoring, and I will weave those questions into our conversation. I won't be able to get to all of them if the SFS audience's standards are achieved as the others in the other chats they have been, but I will try to get to as many as possible. So, Irfan, let's get started. I want to start with a kind of very provocative question. How close were we to nuclear conflict on the India-Pakistan border?
Thanks, Joel. On the one hand, I think, when we got two countries that have a history of war, antagonism, and maybe the least amount of daily bilateral communication at the high levels of government because of frostiness in the relationship, I think we're much closer than we want to think about, right? I mean, all you need is one of these bombs that was being lobbed across borders to hit a population center, to have suddenly an escalation that could be quite rapid. And once we get on the escalation ladder, scholars of IR will tell you, and other alums will know from their classes, right, all bets are off. We're really kind of hoping then that calmer heads prevail, etc. But on the other hand, this felt a lot like theater. And so to be equally provocative, I think what we saw over the last week was a macabre theater, right, of escalation. It's a well-rehearsed playbook. Both countries have highly professionalized militaries. There are some questions always about the command and control of the nukes on the Pakistan side of the border, but there's never been a hint that, there was a loose cannon over there. So I don't think we were at the scariest end of it, but we were at a pretty scary part of the escalation ladder. And while we avoided the worst outcomes, we should not lose sight of the fact that on both sides of the border, lives were lost, right? Innocent lives of everyday citizens just trying to live their lives, and suddenly, it ended because of sort of decisions made at the highest levels of their respective governments.
But, you said that we've seen this kind of script before, but there were elements of this script that were quite unusual. Why don't you tell us a few of the aspects of this latest manifestation of the India-Pakistan tension or conflict? How did it differ from the previous scripts that we've seen on this?
So the script, just for those who don't maybe spend all their time worrying about India and Pakistan, has been that up till 1971, there have been two large wars, right, all-out wars. In 1999, it once again recurred into a war between the two sides. And then we have had throughout this period sort of this skirmishes escalating to some militarization, largely precipitated by the playbook has been a militant attack in Indian-occupied Kashmir or Indian-administered Kashmir. India immediately blames Pakistan for funding, abetting the militants that did this. There's a lot of proof to suggest that Pakistan has often been behind this. We have a lot of evidence, even from the Pakistani side, of ex-generals, ex-intelligence agents saying that asymmetric warfare and the use of irregular militants has been part of the playbook. They see that as part of their comparative advantage, where the fight against India leveling out maybe the conventional weaponry imbalance that they think that they have. India then might retaliate. But what changed this time was that the level of retaliation, even compared to 2019, which was the last time we kind of got close to this kind of situation, was much greater. And part of that, I think, Joel, tells us that both countries have invested tremendously in a new set of toys, right? I mean, to be somewhat facetious about it, military weaponry that they did not have before, that allows them now to launch more sophisticated attacks from further away, and also to defend themselves against it. So we saw over here the first known deployment of India's new air-to-surface missiles. We saw deployment on the Pakistan side of Chinese-made air-to-air missiles. We saw on the Indian side the use of drone warfare that Israeli-made. On the Pakistan side, drone warfare by Turkish-made weaponry. And we saw also a widening of the scope of conflict. So we saw not just attacks in the contested area of Kashmir on both sides of the border, but we saw attacks all the way up to Lahore and Islamabad on the Pakistan side, in Amritsar and Punjab on the India side of the border. So India was doing mass drills on sort of how to deal with conflict, blackouts in the North Indian states. So I think just in terms of what both sides seem to recognize that where we were because of the weaponry that they have access to now was an uncharted territory, and we kind of got in some ways a real-time display of the new toolkit that both countries enjoy.
Well, I'll get to the issue of the new toolkit because I want to figure out what we've learned from that new toolkit and its effectiveness and what it means. But your point that this incursion has gone much deeper into both territories, and especially in the Punjab, in the heart of Pakistan, near Islamabad, near the military headquarters in Rawalpindi. What is the symbolic significance of India striking so close to the heart of Pakistani power? How does that change, or does it change the dynamics of the Indian-Pakistan conflict that India could hit so close?
I think it does, right? The other thing that we did not have happen, but I want to just put on the record, is that India also mobilized its new aircraft carriers into the Indian Ocean, right? And there were reports saying that they were in a position that they could strike through ship to surface missiles as well, right? A capacity that Pakistan doesn't have. So there's two things that happen. I mean, this again, we're talking really about the events of um, the end of last week, but this all started on April 22nd with a terrorist attack in India's side of Kashmir, in which 26 tourists were killed by terrorists, right? And so we don't want to lose sight of the precipitating event that led to this. But what then is striking is that India took the better part of 10 days, right, making clear that they intended to strike, that they saw this as their legitimate option, but not doing it immediately. That tells me that this was now purposive, right? This wasn't just sort of, hey, we have to be seen to be acting. This was pulling together the top intelligentsia in the military, in the strategic establishment on the political side, and saying, how do we attack? So the presumption is that the attacks on near Islamabad in the Punjab were very deliberate and intentional. And what that tells me is that India wanted to demonstrate that there was no part of Pakistan that was going to be safe from a potential retaliation, that it actually wanted also to signal that in the past we have kept this very localized, and now the whole country is potentially at risk, right? That we have the capacity to do that quite dominantly. To that extent, it sent to Pakistan, I think, a signal that its response had to be equally aggressive over there. And this is where we begin to get to the scary part of the scenario, which is that a scenario in which large geographic centers and population centers in both countries were now targets, right? Potentially, not just in India or Pakistan occupied Kashmir. That raises the stakes, and it raises the potential for escalation beyond control quite dramatically.
So what you were talking about, the fact that they've used drone warfare, they use new technologies, that there was a different type of interaction in addition to the geographic, but technologically and in terms of the security response. What have we learned about the India-Pakistan capacity to inflict harm on each other short of nuclear capacity? And how will that sort of shape the conflict? As you say, India is demonstrating that it can go much further into Pakistani territory. Pakistan showed its ability to use drones and other forms of technological advances to attack India. What does that say about the nature of the conflict and how it's changing?
I think what it tells us mainly is that, like any good South Asian cricket match, the most likely outcome is a draw, right? Not a victory for either side. Uh, and this one was a draw. I think both sides get to claim that they did what they set out to do, right? I mean, so India shows that it's capable of striking back and is willing to do that. It's not going to turn the other cheek, which is important for the government politically. Pakistan gets to say that it was able to defend itself. It acquitted itself very well, including uh, shooting down, it claims, maybe as many as 7 of India's brand new French-made Rafale jets, right, which is supposed to be, right, the leading edge, the edge of the spear of the Indian Air Force. If that's in fact the case, that many aircraft were lost, that would be a pretty significant blow for the Indian Air Force. In both sides were able to show that they could use drones, but also were able to put on display their defensive capabilities of neutralizing missiles coming in, neutralizing this. Now, Joel, the other thing that we have to remember here is that all we know about a lot of this stuff is what the governments have claimed to have occurred. That we don't have independent verification on a lot of these claims, especially on, how many jets were shot down, how many missiles were neutralized. We're still in the fog of war where the narrative construction on both sides is very active. It'll take a while to really sort through and, assess what exactly occurred. I think we saw political unity on both sides that suggests that this is now bipartisan, right? I mean, that it's always been India-Pakistan unifies both sides, unfortunately, quite clear. There's no real voices for peace, etc. But that's more important on the Pakistan side of the border, where the civilian government is relatively weak, and they've been dealing with a lot of domestic opposition over the imprisonment of Imran Khan, the disqualification of his party, the PTI, from political office and from the political space. So they were pretty beleaguered. They have a pretty weak economy, and so this is a huge rally around the flag opportunity for the Pakistani government. India, of course, doesn't have those same problems. Mr. Modi is, incomparably popular. There is no meaningful opposition on the Indian side of the border. He's got a coalition government, but he runs it as a majority government and has now been in power since 2014. But coming a year after an election that didn't quite go his way, right? I mean, it was much more underwhelming than his supporters wanted. It's also a rally around the flag effort and sort of burnishes his credentials as being the strong man that India will defend India against all coming. So I think both sides come away over here. And what we actually know is really that, if we were hoping for a longer term resolution of the Kashmir conflict, as opposed to just something that now might subside for a few years, then there's another terrorist attack, and we go back to this playbook, and you and I are having a version of this conversation again. I don't think we're seeing any signs that we're any closer to resolution than we were 5 years ago, right? There's no conversation occurring between the two countries. There's been an underinvestment in diplomatic resources. The border is more shut for trade and even just personal visits between populations that have family on both sides of the border than it's been in a long time. So on that side of it, beyond again bemoaning the loss of life over the last 3 weeks, I'm depressed because I just don't see how we get past this to something that feels peaceful, that allows the region to sort of take advantage of this huge population, be able to trade with each other, and bring the economic prosperity that the citizens deserve.
Well, look, it's clear that you have concerns about the long-term trajectory of the the India-Pakistan conflict at the moment. Let's just talk about the immediate likelihood that this ceasefire and this truce holds. I mean, is it possible that India, Pakistan are regrouping? Is there a serious agreement that is holding this? Um, or are we likely to see this perhaps as a temporary pause and a return to some form of conflict very soon?
So if you'll indulge my analogy of theater, right? I mean, I don't want to make light of what was a very scary situation, in which people, some hundreds of people lost their lives. But this, for me, feels like the stereotype of the two guys on the playground of a school, like you know, hoping that their friends hold them back. Say, "Don't fight me, don't let me come at you," and kind of relieved that both sides are kept aside because they don't quite know where this is going to go. This is an unwinnable war for both sides, right? I mean, what does victory over India look like for Pakistan? There is no such prospect. What does the other way look like? We're talking about a country of, you know, 300 million on one side of the border, 1.4 billion people on the other side of the border, both of whom have nuclear weapons. So it's an unwinnable war. There was no obvious military objective. The objective here, and you had, a bit of a slip at mentioning Israel, but the analogy here is to Israel and Lebanon, where Israel has long accused the Lebanese governments of fueling and supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, right, in order to sort of wage war against Israel. And when Israel attacks Lebanon, it is to punish. It is to basically say, we will inflict pain on you until you do something about these guys on your border that continue to cross, unchecked. That was what India's objective over here is. It is to say, we know that the militants on your side of the border operate with impunity because you are looking the other way or outright abetting them. So we want to inflict pain on you in order for you to really do something about them, right? Pakistan enjoys plausible deniability. They get to say, no, no, we had nothing to do with it, and you're just accusing us unfairly. Uh, but if this war was about inflicting punishment, right, on Pakistan in order to get Pakistan to sort of come back and really say, hey, this is not worth it. We have to really do something about these terrorists that are using our side of the border as a safe haven. We didn't get there. And to get there would require a lot more pain and suffering than India is capable uh, of imposing than we would. So all of which is to say, Joel, I think this is a truce that both sides wanted because escalation was not going to take them anywhere that they wanted to go or that they're prepared to go. Um, so I don't think I'm not concerned about a reversion to all-out conflict. I think they're happy to have gotten to where they are. But I think what all we've done is kick the ball down the road because the underlying problems that have led to three all-out wars, multiple such escalations, and regular incursions. Kashmir remains the most heavily militarized part of the world, right? I mean, the day-to-day life over here is simply not something that we imagine to be a stable long-term uh, solution for peace. I don't see where the political imagination is to get us past that.
So, look, I want to now turn to the role of other actors in this conflict. In particular, there have been lots of questions already about China and the role that China played in this conflict and in the role that the U.S. played in mediating this conflict. Let's start with China. What role did China play? Has there been any change in China's engagement that shifts in any way our understanding of the nature of this conflict?
China's most obvious role is that it has now become the sponsor for Pakistan, right? In a way that once the United States was over the last 10 years, but definitely over the last 5 years since the fall of Kabul and the the victory of the Taliban over there. Uh, but really, the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, the end of the conflict in Iraq, uh, as such as it is, and the withdrawal of that, it allowed American strategic actors to shift further east to thinking about Asia and in particular thinking about China and really saying, look, the Middle East is no longer our problem. We're going to leave it over there. That meant Pakistan suddenly became expendable in US strategic policy, left a bit of a vacuum. China was very happy to fill it. It made Pakistan a poster child of its Belt and Road Initiative, investing in infrastructure, building highways and roads, embassies, the whole ball of wax. But as we also saw, clearly supplying Pakistan with its best weaponry as well. Rhetorically, China chose to play the role of saying, hey, we need an independent um, evaluation panel to find out exactly what occurred, which was exactly the Pakistani rhetoric, denying its complicity in the original attacks of April 22nd. The fact that China felt like it was going to step out into the world and say something on that suggests to me that they saw this as a chance to influence global public opinion and also to assert themselves in that role. So I think definitely a change. Old China probably doesn't say anything, right? It stays behind. It vetoes something in the Security Council, but it doesn't choose to speak out loud. So I think they do see this, the closer relationship that has been bipartisan, starting with Obama through Trump 1, through Biden, now Trump 2, of the US really saying India is our partner in the region, clearly is something that China has an eye on. And so this was a chance for them to really just sort of, turn the needle, if it were, right, turn the knife for India and say, we're going to remind you that this is not just India, Pakistan. We are on the sidelines over here with the rooting interest.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. So the U.S. originally, first, J.D. Vance said, not our problem. Later on, Trump comes in and claims his intervention helped mediate and his tariffs kind of help push it in the right direction. What role do you think the U.S. did play? It's fascinating, of course, to see that the Pakistanis acknowledge the U.S. role The Indians didn't acknowledge the U.S. role. Tell us a little bit about how they, both of them, see the U.S. role in this, and what do you know about what the actual role the U.S. played in mediating this?
We don't, I mean, again, this is so opaque and it's also real time that we don't really know. We know that, of course, that Vice President Vance was in India, not, during this 2 week period of high uh, tenseness. We know that he said that this was an issue for the Indians, for the South Asians to figure out for themselves. And then we know that Secretary Rubio really stepped in and was quite visible in sort of an making sure that people knew that he was on the phone with both Delhi and with Islamabad and sort of exercising the kind of role that the United States traditionally has tried to play all over the world, but also in South Asia. The Indians have been willing to say that America, like it has in the past, engage in parallel calls, which they mean to say, we know they called Islamabad, and yes, they called us, right? What they want to disavow is the notion that what the Americans did was force these guys to sit at the same table and negotiate, like a couple of squabbling kids, brought to the table by their parents. This is long-standing. India has been allergic to any suggestion that it welcomes or would be willing to accept mediation of this conflict because it's part of the Indian doctrine. And again, this goes back 7 years, right? This is not the last 10 years. 7 years that this is Indian sovereign territory that has been illegally occupied by Pakistan, and therefore there is no mediation to be had. There is no mediated solution to be had. Pakistan, on the other hand, has always made the argument that India's original sin is violating the terms of a UN plebiscite or demand for a UN plebiscite back in 1948 and suggesting that the international community should be involved because if they did, they would see that Pakistan's claims to the territory were legitimate and therefore an international solution was welcome. So both sides historically have taken a very different view on the role of the international community in this, but India absolutely rejects it completely and nothing about this is going to change. We have the X factor of we are also in the midst of trade negotiations between the two countries because of the Trump tariffs. So India has had to be very diplomatic about this, because they have a lot to lose if the Trump side has its ego dented or feels like they were insulted or humiliated and decides to not be as uh, willing to negotiate on the trade side. So I think there's a delicate dance of the Indians wanting to make clear that everyone understands its position on this. Maybe a little bit of saying, hey, we are a global power as well, and we don't need other countries to step in. But I think it's more the historical idea of sort of the nature and understanding of the conflict and whether or not mediation, as it were, um, is ever going to be considered appropriate.
Do you think that the way in which the U.S. responded and the way that China responded, uh, does it do anything to actually deepen the engagement between the United States and India? U.S. sort of supporting India to fight against terrorism, U.S. kind of making it clear that that although it did reach out to both sides, it is kind of sympathetic to some aspects of the Indian claims being made. Uh, how do you think it changes the dynamic of Americans' closer relationships with India and actually a bit of the disentangling of the engagement with Pakistan over time?
I think on the strategic side, you're right. It definitely sends a signal that while the United States was willing to call both sides, all the public rhetoric was reinforcing India's right to defend itself. India's right. There were both Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio, and this was splashed over every Indian newspaper and every Indian news site. Uh, the quote saying, "We support India's right to defend itself, India's right to its sovereignty, etc." So I think the public rhetoric was very clear that the United States sees India as its key partner. That is where the alignment is. Pakistan, in that sense, is isolated from the United States, right, and it reinforces that. I think on the Indian side, though, there's a wide open uh, perspective that Mr. Trump, President Trump, is a wild card. They see some of that as being potentially positive because they're not worried about him asking awkward questions about democracy or religious intolerance, etc. But the trade stuff came as a real shock to the system for them. They were hoping that the investment that they had made with the United States over the last 8 years, both the Trump one and then under Biden, kind of insulated them, and all the anger would be really on China. So they're hoping now to sort of unravel some of that. And then the immigration and diaspora stuff, the attacks on H-1B visas, the attack on student visas, for instance, hits India personally, right? There's a lot of families with a rich diasporic history over here, lots of Indian students who come to the United States, including to Georgetown. Lots of 70% of all H-1B visas are taken by Indian nationals. So I think there's a multi-layered dimensionality to the relationship. But on this one, I think this has been good for the relationship because there's very little to say that other than people maybe saying, why are the Americans claiming credit for what we don't think they should be claiming credit for? I don't think there was any doubt as to which side the Americans were on, and that's good for the relationship.
Well, look, we've talked about how the governments, the elites are approaching this. We've talked about the U.S., China, and international dimension. There was a question, I think a really interesting question, about the shifts in general population and public views. And you actually do survey research, is something that you're very engaged with. What is this latest iteration of the conflict, in the background of changing Pakistani politics and Indian politics, which are obviously shifting in diverging directions? What do we know about public opinion and each one of these incursions, how they kind of shape public opinion that might ultimately be the foundation for even greater tensions between the two countries going forward?
I wish I had something optimistic to say on that front, Joel, but I don't. It's very sad. I mean, these are two countries that have shared history, shared culture on both sides of the border. People have family on who are left behind, as it were, right, and all of that. It is the longest border between two large countries that has as little trade as there is. That's a terribly constructed sentence. But given the size of the economies and the size of the population, South Asia has the lowest intra-regional trade in the world, right? There is no other part of the world that trades as little within the region as not. So if nothing else, the amount of money, the amount of prosperity that is literally being left on the table because we have this closed border is incredible to conceive of, right? Just the amount of economic prosperity that could be generated. But because of the long-term underinvestment in sort of just ordinary relations between citizens, opinions have hardened. My own surveys, the surveys of the National Election Studies in India, on Pakistan side, we don't have as much high quality public opinion polling, but the data that do exist suggests that opinions on this are quite hard now. There's, just because people are not exposed to the other side at all, there's no interpersonal exchange of it. The narratives that have been put out by the governments on both sides have been very, very unidimensional. And it's striking because when Mr. Modi first came to power, he actually made an unscheduled visit to Karachi to attend the wedding of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's daughter, right? It was an opportunity maybe for Nixon goes to China. If anyone was going to make peace with Pakistan, a person whose credentials as a hardline Indian nationalist would have been that person. And 10 years later, we're in a position where the border is closed. We have cut off the water to the Punjab to the abrogation of the Indus Water Treaty. We have disqualified, we've cut off visas. I hope a lot of that stuff gets renewed, but the long-term solution over here, in a way that we learned from France and Germany 70 years ago with the European Coal and Steel Commission, is we have to allow for basic trade, basic travel across the region so that people see each other as human beings as opposed to wrapped in the flags of the individual countries.
Well, perhaps my last question would just be, look, we could be on a trajectory in which we just see these, as you say, every few years, and I'll be inviting you back again. As someone asked, not with a Michigan shirt, incidentally, there was a question on that one. But what should this audience be looking for to say that equilibrium might shift to something else, even more worrying, to full-scale ongoing war? What would be the indications that it's not just going to be just another round, that
I
something
think
has changed?
if I were the spoilers, right, who benefits from there being continued conflict over here? And the group that benefits the most, in the most immediate terms, are the militants and the separatist groups in Kashmir who have basically made their life's mission to make sure that there is no peace over here, and in particular to escalate India's side of the conflict in terms of Hindu-Muslim violence. So one of the really sad things we heard over here was that India, uh, on the Indian side of the border was that the violence committed by these terrorists took a religious characteristic where they were asking people whether they were Hindu or Muslim, or to prove that they were Muslim, if Muslim spared, if Hindu killed. That feeds into a narrative in India about Hindu-Muslim relations that's very, very bad. But it sort of then reinforces for the terrorists that their job is to defend Muslims and Islam in a very perverse and perverted way, sort of thing. If I were them, right, I'd be thinking about how do I strike really quickly? I got these guys bombing each other. I don't want peace. I want them to be at loggerheads with each other, because if they're loggerheads with each other, I'm relevant, right? And so I think the thing we should be worried about right now is, does Pakistan, even though they won't outwardly claim to legitimate this, are they going to try and crack down on these guys to make sure that, hey, we're not going to allow any attacks, we're going to actually have some real consequences of it? Or do they see this as, hey, we came out of this really looking really good, and we don't mind if you give you kind of carte blanche to have another attack? I think more attacks, especially if they happen quickly, we get back to where we are right now. Whereas if, say, we get 2 or 3 years in between them, we might be able to ratchet it down. So we're starting at a lower level of tension, a lower level of on the ladder of escalation than we are currently.
Well, look, Irfan, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. And thank you, all of SFS alums and others, for joining us on another SFS Fast Break. They keep coming fast and furious because events keep coming fast and furious at us, and we will continue to engage with you. Thank you so much. You got at least one vote of confidence for the Michigan shirt in the chat. But I appreciate everyone who joined us and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Take care.